I'm Amanda Chan. I'm the deputy editor at teenvogue.com. And obviously, we've got Mayim Bialik
Hi,
here.
everybody.
So, as I'm sure everyone here knows, Mayim is an incredible actress. Started on Blossom, on Big Bang Theory now. She's a scientist. She's a mother. She's an author. She does it all, basically.
Neuroscientist, yes, thank you.
Neuroscientist, that's right. PhD from UCLA. Anyways.
You can stop talking about me now.
But we're here today to talk about our new book, Girling Up, How to Be Strong, Smart, and Spectacular. So really excited for this chat. I'll start it off. We're going to do some questions at the end also, so be thinking, but I'll kick it off with the first round. First of all, how are you? Hello.
You know, I'm doing okay. I saw many of you in line today. I know I signed a lot of books. We did 2 book signings today, and it's been really nice. I've actually never been to a book convention like this, so it's been fun to sort of experience a bit of it, wait in line at bathrooms, so... You know, the things you do. It's very different than Comic-Con, but there are a lot of good similarities too.
Excellent. So first of all, I mean, can you just tell us a little bit about your book? What is it about?
My book is about the experience of going from being a girl to a young woman. I wrote the book for, I guess, 10 to 18-year-old girls, or anyone who ever was a 10 to 18-year-old girl, or anyone who's ever known a girl or cared for a girl in that age range. And that's not something that Penguin has me say so that we sell a lot of books, but I think what I've heard from a lot of women who are not 10 to 18, but who are older, is that this book did not exist when most, possibly all of us, were growing up. It certainly did not exist when I was growing up, and it left me with a lot of questions not having this kind of resource. So that really was the basis for writing this book. And the book covers everything from from puberty and kind of the science of being female versus male, but we talk a lot about gender fluidity and how your brain and body grow and how we learn, how we cope with difficult things, and then how we sort of make an impact in the world. And there are things that absolutely relate to boys. I get a lot of mixed questions like, why isn't there a book for boys? Like every other book in human history pretty much was written for boys. So but there is a lot, that can also apply. The stuff about eating disorders and body image and social media and aspects of dating and the lack of courtship in the dating world today. Those things absolutely apply. No matter what your gender identification or your sexual orientation. Those are just sort of equal opportunity challenges, for the 21st century.
Totally. And you mentioned that you wish that you had a book like this when you were growing up and a
Right.
teen. And is there a particular experience or a particular something that was an impetus that wanted
All of them, all of my experiences. Well, I think I remember most prominently, dating or lack thereof. And actually, the reason that I was approached by Jill Santopolo at Penguin, actually, I'm going to totally embarrass you. Jill, can you wave your hand? This is the person who made me write this book. Jill reached out to me after I had written an article about the episode of Big Bang Theory where Amy and Sheldon are intimate for the first time. There were some little ones I saw, so I'm being very delicate with words. But I have a website called Grok Nation, and I recommend, thank you. I recommend if you haven't gone to Grok Nation, I think you should, even if you're just a Big Bang Theory fan and not a Mayim Bialik fan, because I do write a lot about behind-the-scenes things that happen on our set. And I had written an article for Grok Nation about that episode, and I wrote about being a late bloomer and what it's like playing a late bloomer on television. And Jill reached out and said, I love this kind of voice that you present. And it's not coming from a religious or a political perspective. It's literally just you're a person who guards, kind of modesty and privacy in special ways. And she said, would you be interested in writing a book like that? And I said, yes, but can I expand it out, and not just make it about that particular experience? And so we did expand it out. However, the first chapter I wrote was, for me, the hardest. And that's why I wrote it first. don't know if anybody's a writer here, but sometimes it's actually best to tackle the hardest thing first, and that's what I did. So the chapter on sex and dating, I tackled first, because I think that's where I felt most sort of not in my own body, and also culturally so out of it and not really understanding what was going on. And one of the kind of subtle points I bring up in Girling Up is that sometimes it's confusing, like you want attention from people you're attracted to, or in a way that you think you should be, but sometimes it can feel confusing because, a lot of our kind of feminist sensibility says you shouldn't need that attention, but it's also normal to want attention from other people. So all of that stuff was very confusing to me, and really is still confusing. I'm not a particularly socially well-adjusted adult either, so I still need that chapter, I guess.
No, that was actually one of my favorite, I put a note here, that was one of my favorite parts of your book, is how you were saying, it's okay to be a late bloomer, and personally it actually helps you get in touch more with your own feelings and your own self.
Right.
And that's something that we're all for that at Teen Vogue, so I was like, yes.
Right, and there's nothing wrong with not being a late bloomer, which Jill made sure that we wanted to not, kind of have it be like, if you're not a late bloomer, you're screwed, like,
No, but it's
you're on your own. No, but we really
Getting to know
wanted,
yourself first.
exactly,
Yeah.
and also being an acceptance of the choices you make, and having the most information that you can to make your choices.
Exactly.
Because I think a lot of us just don't have information about things, or we don't know how things work in our bodies and our brains. So that was really my feeling, is that everybody really does get to do whatever they want. This isn't a book about like why you shouldn't hold hands till you get married. Like it's not for me to tell you how to particularly live your life. And it was the same when I wrote a book about parenting or about being vegan. Like, I know how I did it. I don't know how you should do it. But my feeling is it's our human right and our right as women to all be on a level playing field in terms of the information we have about our bodies.
Absolutely, yeah. And I actually have a background as a health editor, so I was also really into your science-based approach. You start off every chapter explaining, like, scientifically what is going on in your body, and this is why it's happening that way. And can you explain a little bit more about your intentionality with writing your book in that manner?
Yeah, so, as a scientist, I sort of view the world scientifically, and even though, after I got my degree, I was a stay-at-home mom, and I still saw the world as a scientist, every diaper change was just an opportunity to do research, No, but I think it's important, and I do talk about that sometimes the things that we study, even if we don't choose to have a career in them, those are still the things that make up your heart and your spirit and, your consciousness of the world. So for me, that really is how I approach my understanding of myself as a female. It's really what gave me a great understanding for the way that I chose to parent. I'm an advocate, I'm a lactation educator counselor, I'm an advocate of things like breastfeeding or natural birth, and like those were things that physiologically make a lot of sense. Like neurochemically, those make sense. So for me, that's sort of like how I approach everything. And I think that was something that Jill, really pushed me to not fear. Because I think that, even though, a lot of people assume I'm like super confident because like, I wear high heels. But but I'm actually a very not super confident person, and that's just, who I am. But I'm, even as an adult, even as an accomplished adult, even as somebody who has a PhD, I'm still nervous that like I'm too nerdy, or that I shouldn't write a book that's like too heavy-handed or it'll be too serious. And I remember when I kind of gave Jill that first draft, she said, like, we need more. Like, you can go ahead and talk more about the science of nutrition and the science of the body. And she really encouraged me to find... No? Scared? Not so much. Okay. No, she really encouraged me to find places where my science brain would automatically be finding what's the scientific reason behind stress? Like, what are all these things? And to really infuse it. And I'm grateful that she did that because I think it lends a really nice thread and it really keeps the book feeling, kind of appropriately clinical.
Well, you also have a section of your book that's dedicated to the idea of coping, including healthy and unhealthy ways to cope and options for healthy ways to cope. Why was it important to you to put such an emphasis on this in your book? And what is unique about growing up today that makes a section like this necessary?
Well, this is like, I'm trying to see how young, what's the youngest person in this room? Just, can I get a number? Who's 10? Oh, okay. Is there a 9-year-old in the house? 8? 7? Okay, 10. We can work with 10. So I'm thinking, because I have an 11-year-old, I'm like, how would I say this? So the reason is because I grew up, and many of us grew up in a culture that did not speak about difficult things, and we are all suffering because of that. You know, many of us in our generation and previous generations grew up with, you know, with alcohol abuse and with drug abuse and with mental illness and violence. And I mean, gosh, this just became a really depressing section. But no, but like, we need to talk about those things because we can't keep shoving it down. Like, as a society and as a culture, we can't shove those things down. And what I wanted to present was an explanation of literally what happens to your body when you're stressed. And also I thought of things like, you know, many of us didn't grow up in a generation of war, you know, like my parents were born during World War II, right? So like, but I grew up kind of between things. I'm like between Vietnam, you know, but now we have young women growing up who know about war and who have, you know, family members going to war, and it's in the news every day. Like, that really weighs on you. And when I think about the increase in eating disorders and mental health struggles that we're seeing, like, all of these things add up, and I really wanted to try and communicate, you know, from a scientific perspective, that your body cannot take stress any more than your heart can, you know, and that things happen, and here are the ways that we can cope with them. And it was very difficult to write that chapter. That's the most personal chapter, you know, in the whole book, because obviously the sex chapter is mostly about other people's lives. No, but the coping chapter, you know, I shared very personally about, you know, some of the stresses that I had experienced and what are the top, you know, stressors that psychologists have identified and what does it do, and what are the free ways that we can deal with them, because, you know, we have a culture now where basically the wealthy get mental health care, you know, and that's a tragedy. Like, we should be protesting in the streets that we don't have mental health care unless, you know, unless you're one of the financially elite. So I really wanted to try and provide a practical guide, you know? Like, this is not just like, oh, Mayim Bialik wanted to like make lots of money and put her face on a book and be like, do yoga. There are actually things that we can do to take control over our neurochemistry and over the chemicals in our brains and in our bodies. And a lot of those things are things you don't even need to leave your house or your neighborhood, you know, to achieve. So yeah, I guess that's just me doing, you know, my small part. And, you know, I spent a lot of years of my childhood like hitting a ball against a fence. Like, that was my activity. But, you know, there are other things, you know, to do.
Okay, happier question now.
Oh, I'll make it sad. No, I'm just kidding.
Again, I love that your book ends up with talking about the future and identifying your passions. And obviously you have multiple passions. You were passionate about science, you're passionate about acting. And how personally did you come to develop these two unique passions and kind of, you know?
You know, I don't, somebody asked me this in one of the signings, you know, I don't want to say I don't think about it that much, because I think about everything way too much. But, you know, I just kind of like think about, like, this is just who I am. It wasn't like a conscious, I'm going to develop this side of myself, and then I'm going to develop this side of myself. You know, I really thrived on stage as a kid. I come from a very interesting family. I'm a second-generation American. So, you know, I grew up in a very ethnic household. My grandparents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, and I grew up in a traditional Jewish home, and there's a lot of sort of like presentation value to our culture. Like, we sing, and, you know, the Passover, you have to recite the 4 questions. So I was very comfortable in that arena, and I found that I loved that in school. But in terms of like what I think is, you know, sort of meaningful and purposeful for me, being a scientist was very, very fulfilling. And, you know, I sort of accidentally came back into the world of acting. I had a toddler and pretty much an infant, you know, a newborn, when I started auditioning for things again. My plan was not to be a full-time actor again. My plan was to teach. I taught neuroscience for 5 years after getting my degree. I also tutored piano. I tutored Hebrew. I did a lot of things that families do to make ends meet and to budget. You know, at that time in our life, that was our reality. I'm divorced now, but at the time when we were married, my ex was in grad school. Like, we were juggling a lot of things. So for me, it's just sort of like who I am. Those are things that I do. And I'm very grateful, to be acting again, but I still think of myself, as a scientist.
And if anything, you're proof that like you can have interests in more than one thing. And
I didn't know we needed me to say that, but yes, you can do whatever,
you
you want. Right.
You can be interested in more than one thing. Wow.
Right.
Awesome. There's a quote in your book, and I'm going to read
it.
Being in the public eye.
Jill wrote that. Jill wrote it. No, I'm kidding. I wrote it.
Being in the public eye as a child made me think a lot about the ways people look at females and what they expect of us. It's different from being a guy. I was expected to look a certain way and act a certain way, all while going from being a girl to a young woman in front of everyone's eyes. It was a lot of pressure, and it led me to realize how different the world is for women compared to men. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about how society treats women compared to men?
Yeah, and it's hard because I think, especially for younger women, women younger than me, of which there are many, I think that because of social media and because of sort of the change in the images we see of women, and I'm trying to be delicate here, the emphasis on precocious sexuality, for lack of a better social conservative phrase, I think that it's even more different than it was. When I was younger, because I was a late bloomer, and because my mother was frankly afraid to talk to me about a lot of the things that I talk about in chapters 1 and 4. No, I think like my mom really felt like she I don't have to deal with it because she still looks like a little girl and she's 16, like we're good. But I think that when I think about girls now and the difference in images that they see and the emphasis on celebrity, which really did not exist when I was on Blossom the same way, it is much different. But that being said, even when I was on Blossom, there was still this notion, 80s beauty and 90s beauty was like Pamela Anderson, like Playboy Bunny. That was really like, if you didn't look like that, you were never gonna get married. Like that's literally that's where my mind went. And the hope was that one day you'd look like those women. Not that men would mature or want something different. It was like one day I'll be her, And I think now we're seeing in some ways more acceptance of different types of women and different body types, but I do worry that the emphasis is still on this kind of hypersexualized version of females. And part of what I also emphasize in the book, which I think is important, is that men and women, again, globally speaking, are different. There are differences in courtship. There are differences across all primates with how males and females operate. And we are animals in a lot of ways. We see a lot of those patterns. But I don't think that should bind us. I don't think, Freud said biology is destiny. I don't know if it's necessarily our destiny, but there are sometimes, kind of roadways that we can traverse. Can't say a word. But I do think that even as a teenager, I realized how much emphasis there was on attractiveness, cuteness, smiling, doing what people wanted. I mean, I speak to grown women now who say that they are still sometimes asked by men, why aren't you smiling? It's my job to smile. Well, it is my job to smile. That's about it. No, but I think I really wanted the book to have a 21st century kind of flair. And I know that I sound like a lot of girls' moms when I talk about the Twitter, No, because there are things that I can't, and I'm sure you get this too.
Yeah,
when you're talking to teenagers or even women in their early 20s, it's a very different vocabulary, and we need to find common ground to be able to communicate. But yeah, some of it is really shocking in terms of the expectations girls have of themselves. And the fact is, a lot of people call me a prude. I talk about this in the book, or you're too conservative, but I didn't need to wear a thong when I was 10 years old. I really didn't. There was no clothing that couldn't have had a panty line. It wasn't a thing. And when I think about that, clothes now put an emphasis on parts of your body that I think at 10 and 11 and 12 and even 13 and 14, you don't really need to be thinking about. You should be running and playing, I hope there's no thong manufacturers for small girls in the audience. My publicist is sweating. She's like, we wanted that thong endorsement.
You mentioned just now that even now you hear of people, women or girls and being told like, oh, why aren't you smiling? And the sexism behind that. And I feel like also you live in two worlds that are notoriously sexist, right? Hollywood, and then also science can also be sexist, and thankfully I think things are changing, but do you,
Right.
you know.
So, I mean, I bristle a little at the word sexist. I think a lot of, I mean, yes, there are absolutely sexist things that happen, but I think also, you know, in terms, as a scientist, you know, that's a field where women historically have been underrepresented. And if you think about like the last 100 years of history, I mean, women have been underrepresented in pretty much every single field working outside of the home. So these are all things that our culture is still very recently, you know, adjust. Like people have been around a long time, and we're dealing with a real shift really since World War II, you know, in women's presence, you know, in them leaving their homes like actively and things like that. So that's going to change, and it has been changing. So I don't even know if there's sexism. It's more just like an institutionalized.
Maybe representation is
Yeah,
really
it's
more
like an
what it is,
institutionalized patriarchy. Yeah, I mean, but that's what we talk about when we talk about the patriarchy, which men and women live in. You know, we all are living under that umbrella of like, this is the way things were, and these are the expectations for women and for men, you know, and all of that is absolutely shifting. And, you know, in Hollywood, it's absolutely, I mean, possibly even, I don't want to say worse, because, you know, as a woman scientist, I mean, I've heard horrendous things. I've had female professors say terrible things to me, and inappropriate things, and things that I probably could have gone to HR about, but I didn't. No, but when you think about the acting world, what's hard is that for men and for women, it literally is about presentation. And, you know, I've spent really a career being told, you're not pretty enough, you're not sexy enough, you're not skinny enough. And a lot of that is, you know, what gives me the ability to be the character roles that many of you enjoy watching me play, because there are all different kinds of people. And the notion that the universal rule for women is to be sexy, skinny, and pretty is also absurd, because we don't always have to be those things either. We can be kind of a full variety of things, like lo and behold. So I think in the industry it's hard because, I mean, you know, if you've ever been to Los Angeles, like everyone looks like a model. Like that's like a thing. That's like a real thing. And it doesn't, you know, again, people think like, oh, you're confident, you're Mayim Bialik. No, I'm not. I go down the rabbit hole of Instagram accounts of people I don't even know and feel bad about myself. Like, it's like kind of a thing. Like I've wasted, my record is like 90 minutes, like literally someone I don't know. And all I'm thinking is like, I don't look like that, like what, you know. And in a lot of cases, I do operate in a world where most people have plastic surgery routinely, like before they even need it, so you can't even tell. So like it tricks you, because you'll be like, when I look that age, I didn't look like that. It's because they started 10 years before they were that age, you know. But that's still hard, that's a challenge, but you're right. The industry really is geared around that. Yeah, and that doesn't feel great. And the industry historically, you know, really kind of runs out of not patience, but usefulness for women. And we've heard more women talking about this for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so
I depressed everyone again.
the next question again is a happy one, and this is also.
I'll make it sad. I'll bring it down.
We just go like this. And it's also my last question before we turn it over to the audience. But given all that, given your experiences in life, given this book and the advice that you lay out in this book, then what advice do you have for girls, teens growing up today who feel like there's so much pressure to be this or that, or they're being told they have to be this or that? Like, what encouragement do you have, if you could give something based on your own experience?
You know, honestly, I feel like I'm still figuring it out, you know, even at 41, and it still varies, you know. I still need to not compare myself, you know, to other women or to people whose lives are totally different from mine, you know. And I think that's harder to do when you're young, because you don't have that sense of perspective, and like your frontal lobe's not even fully developed, you know. So like your notion of judgment is very different. And I say this to my kids all the time, like your brain's literally not done. You make different kinds of decisions, you know, when you're young than you do when you're old. You know, I advocate very strongly for keeping your body as clean as you can, for engaging in athletic activities. And, dance is great and it's wonderful, but that's not the only athletic activity that girls or women, are predisposed to do, just like we're also not genetically programmed to like pink or purple. Like those are, we can do other sports. I think that sports gives you a really, really strong sense of your body, of your strength. It builds up confidence. So I'm a big advocate of that. And I do... I talk a lot about, it's so nerdy, and this was like a section of the book that I really felt like, oh my gosh, I'm such a nerd. The section on hobbies, but like finding out what you like and what you're good at and what you can creatively do, and this notion that art doesn't have to be good for it to be helpful and healthy and productive. So I really encourage, like a broad spreading out of your interests, so that you get to know yourself better, so that when others try and kind of penetrate your sense of self, that you have a lot to build from. And there's this, the perspective I have now as a strange adult who was a strange child and a strange teenager, is that you really, you don't always become like other people, but your sense of anxiety about that does become less. Going to college was so healthy for me because I met more people like myself. I met people who wanted to study and who didn't just want to like drink and party. I met people who wanted to think and talk, and there's nothing wrong with drinking and partying, but I will say that, as a scientist, not just as a mom, like when your brain is developing, when your body's developing, you don't want to mix it up with toxicity, when you're that young. So the more you have those other interests, the more I think you're impervious to some of those pressures, without sounding like an old mom.
Great. Well,
thank you. Those were
Yeah.
great questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know how the mic situation is going to work with questions. Maybe just speak loudly.
Or stand up and then I'll
Yeah.
repeat the question. Or someone with younger ears than I will.
All right, in the back.
Come closer and scream louder. That's my memoir will be entitled that.
Come closer and scream.
I just made her laugh. Look, she's laughing.
That was good.
It's really nice to see you. I'm a big fan of Rock Nation.
Thank you.
My personal favorite is the cat video by cats.
Yes,
Are the best.
cats are the best.
I have a question. You have a very excellent and great way to bring science and spirituality or religion. As someone who is conservative, just personally, spiritually, sometimes it's hard to. I'm also a PhD student, so it's hard to consolidate religion and science and modesty. I also dress more modestly.
Right.
How do you address that in a way that, is the way that people will not just shut you out as someone who's approved?
Right. Do you mean specifically in terms of like dress
Dress and
or just like philosophy? Okay, so the question, you can sit or stand, whatever you want, or come closer and scream louder.
Chair right here.
The question was about, sort of balancing being a scientific person and a person of faith, especially if you're part of a faith like mine, or sounds like yours, that does have, certain guidelines. I don't want to say rules or restrictions, even though all the people who don't like religion are like, the rules and restrictions. But guidelines and boundaries around specifically what parts of myself I show and how. So I make videos. I started aggressively making YouTube videos, and one of them was about science and religion, and I think it has like 10 million views or something. Like it's our second highest rated video, the first being Why Not to Call Women Girls. But I addressed, I'm happy to address it now, but I'm also giving a little shout out for my YouTube page because I'm supposed to. For me, I don't feel conflict between being a person of faith and a person of science. For me, every amazing thing in the universe is evidence that I didn't create it and no one else did. And every amazing thing that I learn about my religious practice or about my spiritual self, has a scientific basis, and it's all, I don't know, I don't feel conflict. And usually the only people who have conflict about that are people who are either not religious or not scientists. Like most religious or observant scientists I know, like it's not like we sit around and talk about like, oh my gosh, what about the dinosaurs in the Bible? Like it's like no one sits. That's not what we talk about at lunch. But meanwhile, atheists are like very angry that there's no dinosaurs. And my 11-year-old was like, "Why are there no dinosaurs?" I said, "Well, it's not like it says there were no dinosaurs in Hebrew, But in terms of like how to make that palatable, or acceptable to other people, this is a hard thing. Being religious these days is really, it's not so popular. And being a modest dresser until like last season was not popular for a long time. But I noticed like with some of the 80s fashion coming back in, like fuller skirts are back. I'm like, finally, I'm not the only one wearing a full skirt. But yeah, like I live in LA where it's like summer all year round, and I see more butt cheeks and breasts than I thought that I ever would in my life, just like in 1 week in Los Angeles. But I think that sometimes when I say not talking about it, I don't mean avoiding it or being ashamed, but I feel like a lot of times, especially if we do things that are against the grain, living by example, and just leading by like, this is what I do, and obviously not being judgmental. A lot of times I'll say, this is what works for me. I don't know, it's just comfortable. Like, oh, do you miss pants? Yeah, sometimes I do, but I wear them at home and it's all good, Or, there's some lucky fella is gonna see more of me than you get to, like, but I think in general, just kind of living by example and showing people that my religious practice doesn't have to impose on them. It's part of who I am, and it gives me happiness. It doesn't have to give you happiness, but if it brings me closer, to feeling spiritually elevated or whole, that makes me a better person to work with and just to hang out with in general.
That's really good. All right, over here.
And being that, what did you do, like, what hobbies did you have that helped you to get through that, oh, there's no one here, what the heck?
The question was about kind of either what hobbies or other things that I sort of did to, pass the time when everyone else was dating and going out and doing things. I watched a lot of 227 with my mother. I did enjoy, I did watch a lot of television as a kid. Tracy Ullman was one of my main female comedian influences, as was Carol Burnett and Lucille Ball. I got a lot out of female comedians and watched, bless you, so I did watch some TV. I was always a musical person. My parents, oh my gosh, my mom told me recently, my parents traded a piece of furniture in our home to barter for the piano that they bought us when it was like 1979. I still have it. It's now 125 years old, and it's the piano that they literally like scrounged. And like I knew that it was like whatever, like $200 back then was so much money, but that they took a piece of furniture like so they could get this piano. So I always played piano, and I liked music a lot. Music was a very safe place for me. I liked very, very dark, mopey, music. I was a big Cure fan and Cocteau Twins and. Very like, I liked Elvis Costello. I liked a lot of like music that I really like, Edie Brickell, like, always people who were like sad and lonely, like, yes, great. I also read a lot. I was not a big reader at all. My academic story is not what a lot of people expect. I was not a particularly good student. I was telling my sons the other day, I was always getting written on the board for talking, and then they would do 1 check, and then 2 checks, and then they send a note home, and my parents were always mad at me because I was always talking. I had terrible penmanship. I wasn't a great student, and I hated reading, and my brother was the reader. He was 4 years older than me, and if anyone's like a second sibling, and they had like a first sibling who was perfect, you know what that's like. It's like, I'm never going to read a book because he does, But when I was a teenager, my father, who was an English teacher, Zichrono Livracha, bless his memory, he started me reading. He tried to find things I could read. He would take me to the library, and he would say, you can tell what a book is like from the first page. And he would make me read the first page. And I discovered J.D. Salinger when I was quite young, and I discovered Jean-Paul Sartre. Like heavy, heavy philosophy really appealed to me. Not the philosophy, but like the... Sartre, I wasn't that interested in reading Being and Nothingness, but I was really interested in reading Sartre's like short stories about people living out these kind of philosophical principles. So reading was a very safe place for me. And I played outside a lot, which is like, for young people, that means you leave your house and there's air and it blows into your lungs. And sometimes I was told, like, go outside and don't come home until I call you for dinner. Like, that was a thing. We would play outside on bikes, and, like, I roller skated, all those things. So those were some of the things. But music was a real safety for me. And I was very grateful that I did find a couple close girlfriends But very few. I lost many, many girlfriends who were interested in things that, in gossip and just like, it just didn't work for me. But I have a couple close girlfriends and we were weird together and we're still weird together. You're welcome.
Great. Right here.
Hi.
So I was watching the show Photos of Boyfriend earlier today, and I came across a group that had these little books. One was like advice for boys, and the other was advice for girls. And in the girls' book, there was one page that said, sometimes your friends could be mean, you should forgive them. I was wondering if your book addresses...
Yeah, I don't believe in forgiveness. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. It actually does. Jill, I'm feeling really good about our book right now. The question was, the comment was that there was a book for girls, and it said, like, sometimes, what is it? Sometimes your friends are mean, you should forgive them? Yeah. And so the question was, do I address this? This was actually a section that Jill and I realized should be added kind of later. And it was one of like those sad realizations when you're writing something and you realize how you're literally writing your saddest moments in a book. It was like, do you feel like your friends are nice to you in front of your face, but they talk about you behind your back? Like, do you feel like your friends try and get you to do things you know are wrong and then you feel guilty after you hang out with them? Like, do you get a gross feeling in your stomach after hanging out with a friend and you don't know why? I was like, this is my life. Like, But what Jill and I talked about is that no one ever said that to me. No one ever said, you may have friends who are mean to you and who are cruel to other children, and you don't have to put up with that. I thought it was like, oh my gosh, like it's like we're in a war and I gotta like stick with those people. But it really would have helped, and that's really why I wrote that section. If you feel gross after hanging out with someone, it may mean that you have less friends than other people do. And although that sounds like, oh, it's so easy to say, what if we raised a generation of girls and boys who did not tolerate unacceptable behavior from other children? Like, what would that world look like, I mean, and I wonder about all the girls who I'm sure, the vast majority grew up to be productive members of society, but I wonder, like, what is that like? Why are we conditioned to behave that way? And especially with other women. And I've actually made friends with a few more prominent women. One is Eliza Schlesinger, who's a comedian, and the other is Rachel Bloom, who's on Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. And I make sure to actively post not BS stuff about our friendships, but when they have achievements, I show that I support them. I love the things they do. Yeah, I'm envious when Rachel Bloom gets to be on the cover of something that I'm not on the cover of, but I want to show that like you can form healthy, intelligent relationships with women who are prettier than you, sexy, like you can have productive friendships that are healthy. And Eliza said to me recently, she said, you're like one of the best people I've met in Hollywood. She's like, we have a real relationship. It's not like a BS thing. So I want to show other women that's possible. It's not like, I'm sure there are many celebrities, I don't know, Heather will tell me later, who are like BFFs and like, here's us drinking martinis and here's us in gold bikinis. That's not my life. Eliza and I like Rachel and I go and have crappy Mexican food and she gets recognized and I don't, and I take the picture of her with her. That totally happened.
That is awesome. All right. Oh, okay. So we'll do the one back here, and then we'll pop here, and then pop here. Go ahead.
She's planning ahead. I like it.
I have a question for women, divorced women in general, when you were talking about dating and the lack of courtship, and how do we kind of gear these,
That might be a book I write later. So the question being about sort of this notion of the lack of it's a very specific question and literally one that I've been asked to sort of tackle. But I'll speak to it briefly, just by show of hands, and if you don't want to raise your hand, who's divorced here? Hi, ladies. What's up? So I've noticed that I learned a lot from this chapter as I go on in life as a woman who's not coupled. For those of us who grew up with a notion of courtship, it's very disturbing that for some reason grown-up men have done away with it as if they're 20, And I've written more about this surrounding girling up and, sort of talking about a lot of the physiological aspects of being male and female and how different that is. I actually just did a video for for our YouTube channel. We just recorded it, and I think it's probably going to be helpful for divorced women in particular, because the notion of open relationships was just discussed in the New York Times Magazine. I'm just going to go ahead and define it because I didn't know either. This means that people have relationships. Thinking about that 10-year-old. People have relationships with more than one person, and it can be male and it can be female. A lot of young people are like, just like, hey, it's all good. And some of us older people are like, what? Like, I don't know how to do that. So, no, so I think it's very interesting, and it is a challenge, and I think it kind of goes with that precocious hypersexuality that we've seen for young girls, and I think it's really expanding to women, and especially when we look at like celebrity women, what they look like after they've had kids versus like what I look like after I've had kids. You know, when I think of what the dating world is like, of course I think that that's what men expect, and I live in LA where men do expect that because that's usually what's out there. But I think it is a topic that needs more addressing, more than just, you know, conscious uncoupling. Courtesy of Goop.
All right, right here.
Hi.
I have two questions, actually. First is, when did you get, like, interested in science? Like, I know people who got interested in a thing they want to do for the rest of their life when they're, like, 4.
Right.
They got interested in writing. And people that waited until their 20s, my brother got interested in law, now he's a lawyer. So when did you get interested in science? And second, less important question is, can I have a selfie and or an aura bath? And cartoon.
I'm gonna. Why don't you both come up here and let's take a selfie, the three of us. Just stand right here. Just come here. This is the one except, so stand here. Hi. I'm gonna turn this way. Just give us a second, we'll be done. I'll answer the first question while we have technical difficulties. I became interested in science late in life. I was 15, and I had a biology tutor when I was on the set of Blossom, and it was her who inspired me to become a scientist. And when Blossom ended, I was 19. I was 2 years out of high school, and I went to UCLA, and I did 5 years undergrad, and then, PhD. Okay, we're ready. 1 second. Lean in. Okay, you're welcome. No, she'll send it to you. Just go sit down. I think we're already in trouble.
All right, and then right here.
It sounds like your book, and I haven't read it yet, has wonderful information and guidance for young girls who are being victimized, for lack of a better word. How do we get the bullies to read it, to listen to these things?
Well, I mean, you know, both of those words are very loaded. I don't mean that you're using them incorrectly. I just mean those are really complicated issues. I mean, I tend to use kind of the victimization word for a very specific, you know, kind of oppression, for lack of a better word. And in terms of bullying, you know, this is something we're talking about and we're hearing about a lot more. You know, I think there is a difference between being teased and being bullied. I think we all know that. And, you know, the absolutely devastating, I don't even want to call it a trend, the devastating statistics that we're seeing about suicide and, you know, with 13 Reasons Why, like all this stuff needs to be more part of our conversation. But I think that, I don't know that I have the answer to that. You know, there are people far more educated than me who hopefully will start to provide more answers. I'm actually speaking for the Jed Foundation, which does a lot of amazing work in this area on Monday night here in Manhattan. But I do think that one of the best things that we can do is to arm ourselves with more protection in the form of knowledge and in the form of education, building ourselves up so that, you know, the notion of imperfection that others may place on us is not as penetrable. But I also think that, you know, part of it is about discourse, part of it is about supervision. You know, my ex and I choose to homeschool our children, so our world of kind of, you know, influence on our children is smaller. which is not a solution. I'm just saying, like, it's, as a parent, it's something that I struggle with as well. But I also think, I wanted to make sure that this book, not to make light of your question, but, in a small way, I wanted to make sure that this book addressed people not only who are different, but people who are not different. To say that we have to acknowledge that there may be girls who do fit the mold, and there may be girls who don't fit the mold. There's not a right or a wrong way about it. So I guess I hope that in a small way, by writing a book that's not just for late bloomers, right? It's not about late bloomers growing up. It's for all girls, so that they can understand that for those girls who are not interested in frilly dresses and makeup, and all those things, that's also considered normal. Like, it's physiologically normal, and that there are girls who really are interested in makeup and in guys and things like that, and that's also normal. So I think, like, that kind of understanding is important, and I think it's missing in a lot of places. I know it was missing for me. I didn't know why I liked cars and boxing. Like, that was weird. My kids think it's weird. Like, why does mama like sports cars more than dada? Because I do.
All right, we have time for one more question. So, right here. Yes.
Hi, so I'm studying neuroscience in the fall, so I was just wondering what made you want to study neuroscience?
I had a moment with the action potential of a neuron in an introductory class my first semester in college, and literally they were teaching about how neurons fire. So neurons are the nerve cells, the cells of your brain and your nervous system. So your spinal cord and all the nerves. It's the way you perceive everything. Is it for me? Maybe. That would be fun. And there was an explanation of the electrical components and the voltage necessities that are responsible for making a neuron understand that something is happening. And I was floored. I was completely floored. And I just thought, gosh, that's unbelievable that everything we think, feel, sense, see, that it's all because of literally like electrical charges, that are going. And I just thought, like, that's the level of understanding that I want to have of the human body and the human brain. 13 years later and 8 months pregnant, I got that degree. So thank you so much for being here. Really, thank you, Amanda.